I'm old, so I don't have much time to be dawdling around. I can't procrastinate too much anymore, although I do like to procrastinate. But my mission is this. I'm seriously trying to promote sexual wellness or sexual well-being among older adults in senior living communities, particularly those adults who are from marginalized populations or have, because of racism or homophobia or transphobia, been really struggling with other issues as well as ageism throughout their lives. So it's a big task, but I'm ready for it.
That's a pretty awesome mission to be on. And it's pretty large because if you're looking at that particular space, there are a lot of stakeholders that you're dealing with, a lot of different vested interests circulating around.
Right.
So maybe if we start with the people that matter most, and that's the older people you're dealing with.
Great.
What are, so some of your work is specifically taking classes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you do sex ed classes with older adults. What is it? Take us into a classroom with you. How do you approach that work?
Well, first, can I step back a little bit? Because, I'm a certified sexuality educator. The international organization that started in the US, the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, has a certification program. And when I was in grad school, just a few years ago, right? I mean, I just finished at the age of 62 when I got my doctorate. I was given a choice. I could have done sex therapy or sex education. And I chose sex education for one really important reason. I believe that change can be made more quickly for us if we work in the larger sphere of groups, either groups in classes or in the macro level in terms of communities or larger institutional change. And I really believe that. And we have so many problems institutionally in so many levels. But I decided that I would start with sex ed with older adults because, by the way, none of my peers were interested in older adults. Everybody was going to talk to young parents or adolescents or people in the veterans, who had come home with disabilities, either PTSD or other physical disabilities. But nobody was really interested in old people. So when I go to a class, here's what I do. The first thing, now, by the way, I don't just teach old people. I also teach the people who care for the old people in a long-term care community. But if there are old people in the audience, the first thing I do is I say, it's okay to talk about sex. And you can see this wave of relief coming over people's heads because for many people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, they've been thinking about having sex. They've maybe even been having sex. In fact, not just anecdotally, but empirically, John Delamater did some very interesting research that found that people were having sex in their 60s and their 70s and their 80s. And anecdotally, people come up to me all the time and say, you see that woman over there in the back of the room? She's 92 and she's got 3 boyfriends or, something like that. And it's real. So, but I'm saying those are anecdotal expressions. But in any case, if they're thinking about sex or if they're having sex or they're longing to have some sexual issue that is about their sexuality, kind of focused on, they don't have a lot of people to talk to about it. So the first thing I say is, let's just make this an okay space. We used to call it a safe space. Remember?
Yeah.
We talked about that in New Zealand, but in the US, we talk about safe spaces. Now we talk about brave spaces. We're going to make this a brave space where it's going to be okay if you really want to ask some hard questions. And then I ask people to kind of go on a little bit of a journey with me about what this idea of sexual wellness or sexuality is. And it's not just about sexual behaviors, but it's really about your identity and your orientation and who you've been attracted to and how that may have changed over your lifespan, right? There's some very interesting research about sexual fluidity and how we may change over a lifetime. And so I talk with people about trauma, and I talk with people about consent, and so much more about skin hunger. Are you familiar with that term? It's a
No, no.
lovely idea. So the idea is, how much do you want to be touched, right? What's okay with you? How close do you want to be to someone next to you? I remember, when I was in elementary school and somebody wanted to hold my hand all the way through the movie and the movie theater, and it just got all sweaty and kind of yuck by the end. But maybe somebody else really liked that. So
Yeah.
my skin hunger might be different than yours. And over time, it might change. And
Mm,
then I talk with people about what are the expected changes throughout your lifespan in terms of your bio, psycho, and social sexual life that you can expect that would be kind of something that we can all um, begin to wrestle with.
yeah.
And I give them tools and I give them resources, but I give them also a chance to have some fun because, old people love to have fun, right? So that's why old people like to have sex. But I bring out my I'll show them to you. I don't know if your listeners can imagine, but I've got a really nice vulva puppet here,
I love
and
your
she's
vulva
just
puppet.
beautiful. And she's got velvet and satin and pearls and a little conch shell for her butt. And then I've got this great penis puppet that I bring out, and we laugh, right? And I
Oh, they're
call him uh,
fabulous.
Richard Johnson. You could call him Dick. I have fun with it, and I teach a little bit of anatomy. You know what I'm saying? I really
Yeah.
try to, and I don't use the word normal anymore. I hate that word. It's just so wrong. There's no normal,
Yeah.
and so I just try to kind of bring it down to where they are in a
Yeah.
way that is fun and exciting. And I bring out lubes and condoms. I always have a basket full of stuff. Not so easy on Zoom to do that with people, but we're getting back, right? The US is coming back to
Absolutely.
life again.
Apparently, it's now taking back some space from New Zealand as a good place to live in COVID.
Oh, that's great. Well, I don't know. I still would like to come and visit you all in Auckland. It would make me very happy. But in any case, I try to make it like another topic of wellness, right? Another area that we can begin to disappear some of those taboos.
There was a beautiful quote from you that I have, possibly paraphrasing. I think it's pretty accurate, with a TED talk where you said, in terms of talking about this stuff, particularly in thinking about sexuality and older adults, if we don't have these conversations, we're denying our elders lives of dignity and pleasure at a time when they need every possible reason to live.
Mm.
And that really resonated for me. I think your point about they are having sex for fun and for pleasure, it's about the extension of sexuality beyond usefulness or reproduction into that space of connection that you talk about.
Mm.
One of the things that interests me about your work is you're backfilling a big education gap, which most of us have come through life with. And a lot of the time in the sex ed space, we look at the implications of the gap in terms of young people, pregnancies, STIs, and we don't, again, look at that space and say, what are the implications of that gap through the journey and at the other end of that journey as an older adult? So from your perspective in that space, what do you see as some of the implications of the sex ed gap facing all of us as we move into that space if we don't have these conversations?
Such a great topic. So thank you, Jane. One of the ideas that I have been talking about a lot comes from a recent article. I don't know if you got a chance to read it, Maggie Symes' article. The title is At My Age. It's such a great article. And she talks about really kind of turning the myth upside down of older people being asexual or uninterested or lacking desire. And so many old people have struggles with mental illness and mental health, and particularly since COVID, right? We were trying to keep older adults safe, but they weren't really healthy, being socially isolated, and dementia has increased. And there's some new reports now that are reminding us that when we keep older adults away from each other, cognitive impairment can actually be exacerbated. So, what I've been trying to do is give people an idea that they can look at their sexuality and their sexual behaviors in a way that Maggie Syme reports that older adults have said, which is that it's gone from this procreative act to a more creative act. It's gone from giving to actually, I'm sorry, let me say it again. It's gone from just giving it to someone else to actually being able to receive through generosity and also through reception. It's gone from this sort of urge and lustful need to more quietude and more conscious connection. And so there's a more compassionate way, I think, that we can imagine sexuality among older adults. And of course, getting older, if we're fortunate enough to get older, means that we've accumulated some losses. We've lost our mates, we've lost body parts, we've lost our health, we've lost our income very often, we've lost our neighborhoods. And so with those losses means that we've got to really assess what we want to be vulnerable about as an older adult. And along with those losses, what I've been talking about lately is this idea of emergent pleasure, that we have the opportunity to create more pleasure. And I brought a book with me today, Sex After Grief, by one of my colleagues, Joan Price, who met a heterosexual woman. She met a guy at a later age and just was smitten and had great sex and great times with him. And then he died. And then she had to kind of pick up her life. And so she wrote this book about navigating, right? This idea of getting through the rough waters of your sexuality after a loss like a loved one. And you might think about that in sort of other ways, right? That I was thinking about older LGBTQ members of our community who came out in their neighborhood 20, 30 years ago, maybe. And they had a community. And then they move into a senior living community. And then they've got to renegotiate and literally re-navigate this whole idea of coming out because of the loss of their community. And so I've been really struck by how resilient people are. And at some point, if you're interested, I'd like to talk about some of my research about resilience and sexual satisfaction because they are connected. And that there might be some lessons that we can learn from this as well.
I'd love to hear about that research. I think also you're raising a topic sort of that loops back to the idea of maybe not just gaps in sex education, but cultural mores around sexuality and navigating grief and loss of a partner when masturbation is a taboo subject. And particularly for older adults, the idea of self-pleasure is something that they wrestle with. And
totally
to open up that space and introduce the idea of being able to be sexual solo. Is that something that you talk about in your work?
Yeah, I talk about it a lot. I always bring up Betty Dodson's name because I love her book about liberating masturbation. And she was really the queen diva of masturbation. And she called it solo sex, which is kind of a softer term, I think. A lot of people think, oh, but the nuns and the priests said I was going to grow hair on my palms if I masturbated. So many taboos about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do talk about it a lot because many people think that solo sex or masturbation is just what you do in between or after you don't have a lover anymore. And I often say to people, your body's changing. Your erogenous zones may not be what they were 20 years ago. So find out and bring that information to your next lover. And I think that's another way of thinking about it, just in terms of doing your homework. And I love giving people homework to do, to have more masturbation. But you know what I wanted to say about this idea of the lack of sex ed, even if older adults had had sex education, which in the US is absolutely abysmal, like 22 states mandate sex ed for kids ages like 6 to 18. Many states, you don't even have to have medically accurate sex education. And some states even prohibit the discussion of homosexuality. Like if the kid says to the teacher, hey, I think I might be attracted to somebody of the same gender. The teacher isn't allowed in those states to talk to the kid, right?
That's
The teacher
crazy.
could get fired. So this idea about backfilling is an interesting one because even if we had decent sex education 20, 30 years ago, we probably weren't talking about consent. And when I talk to older adults, consent is a new idea.
Yeah.
What? I'm allowed to say no, but I'm married. Wait, but that kind of thing. This kind of like head turn of astonishment that I have the ability to have some ability to have agency over my own body. It's just a brand new concept. And of
Yeah.
course, there's cultural stereotypes that, go along with that. So it's even in the places where we've had decent sex ed, people still weren't getting that much information about what I think of as the pleasure side, right? I'm a comprehensive sexuality educator. It means that I'm sex positive. It means that I don't just believe in abstinence only. It means that I really think of the whole person. But many people didn't get anything near that. So I do a lot of backfilling, but I consider it really kind of a service that I'm offering to people in a way that maybe their school system never could have given them because we weren't training sex educators in this sex positive way. We were doing all that fear-based and harm and keep your knees together, girls, that kind of thing.
Now that's going back away.
Yeah, that's my day. That was in my day.
It's a really good call out, Jane, because I'm using the term to in a way that we think about it through the work we do here and incorrectly, because it should be an encompassing, holistic sexuality education. And how can we even ask schools to be that space anyway? And it's more, how do we take your mission, these tendrils, this wonderful activism going on in the world, out into the community of family, friends, us, and the conversations like this one go outside and create spaces for sex to emerge as a bigger conversation.
You are not going to believe what I'm going to say next, but a religious organization in the US has actually been a leader in sex education. I know that's going to blow your mind. But it's the Unitarians. The Unitarians are very different. They have a wonderful curriculum that goes all the way through the lifespan. In fact, they just finished their newest book on older adults. It's called Our Whole Lives, OWL. And OWL, their acronym, is taught in religious institutions all over the country, all over the US, maybe other places. I don't know, maybe it's happening in New Zealand. And they're cool. I mean, they're very progressive. They included an activity for older adults that I wrote for them as a lesson plan. So I know that activity is really good. Just kidding. But really, seriously, they are doing fantastic work. And they're building bridges between adults and their kids. For instance, in a congregation, they don't just want the kids to take the classes. They want the parents to be in their separate discussion groups just with the adults, so that the adults can learn how to answer the questions, how to look for resources, how to be what I call an askable adult, somebody who's got the affect that the kid knows the parent isn't going to flip out when the kid asks them a question. We always tell when I teach parents about talking to their kids, I always say, have your conversations about sex while you're driving, because you're looking forward, they're looking forward, nobody's looking at each other, hopefully, and you're just driving. And that way the kid isn't, reading every grimace or angst-ridden emotion on your face as a deterrent. They're seeing the road and they're asking a question. But I would say that in this particular example I'm giving of OWL, they're doing a really good job of doing what I think of as intergenerational sex education. And one of my hopes, I don't know if I'll ever get there, but one of my hopes is that the older adults that I teach begin to talk to their grandchildren. Wouldn't that be amazing? So that there's not that parent-child thing where I'm a bit squeamish about talking to my own kid, but maybe it's grandma or grandpa that I'm talking to. It's a little bit different. So that's something I've talked with other people. And there's a sex educator in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the U.S. named Tracy Gilbert. And Dr. Gilbert has really done some very interesting thinking about intergenerational sex ed in the Black community, which I love, and I really support her work. And I'd really encourage your listeners to take a look at some of the work that she's doing. She's fantastic.
I love that idea, and the idea of flipping that so that when it comes to our elders, when it comes to our elders, that maybe our young people have a role in opening up conversations about sexuality there the other way.
Yeah. There's a funny cartoon of the kid in front of the laptop, and the father comes and taps him on the shoulder and says, "Well, I guess it's time to talk about sex, son." And the kid turns around and says, "What do you want to know, Dad?" I don't know. So
there is a bit of that going on.
Yeah, so the kids know so much, and they've learned so much in so many different ways. Some of it really helpful, and some of it not very helpful. But it'd be great if the young people could start the conversations. And there are some really good groups in the U.S., like Advocates for Youth. I don't know if you know them, or Scarletine, that are doing sex education with young people, where the young people are on their advisory board. So they're teaching the adults what it is that they need to, bring forward.
And in terms of the parent-child interaction, when we flip it around the other way, I love the idea of taking everybody for a drive. That can work with your older parent as well, like still everybody guys are on the road. Yeah. But when you're doing work with of the children of parents, what do you find are some of the challenges there, and how do we start to unpack those?
I'd say one of the areas that we need the most work on is gender. I think for many of the young people that I've talked with, the young parents I've talked with, gender is really the issue that's coming up much more. For my generation, I'm in my 60s, orientation was really the biggest issue for us, and sexism was the biggest issue for us. But right now, those seem to have taken a bit of a changed role, and that gender has really become part of the major battleground, at least around here. And I would say that the parents really need to kind of get up to speed on language, nomenclature, and eschewing a lot of their assumptions, because they make assumptions based on presentation that may be incorrect. And I know for my own experience, when I get introduced to a new baby, young friends just had a new baby, and they didn't reveal their gender. And it was very simple for me. And so the kid was a they.
Yeah.
That's who they were. They were they. And it was very simple. For my, I have two kids in their 20s. For my kids' friends, when they are going through their own questioning about gender, it's harder for me to make the switch because I've known them as a particular gender, and I have to continually check with myself and sort of check it out. My kids don't have that same issue. They're just much more adept. And so when I talk with parents, gender is often really one of the major battlegrounds that we need to kind of remind parents how to deal with. And it's been a challenge, I think, for many parents to kind of get up to speed about that. Another one is, I think, consent.
Yeah.
When we were growing up, we had to sit on our uncles' laps and it wasn't always pleasant, and it was scary, and
Mm,
we had to be kissed by people that we didn't really like. Go ahead, kiss them, and there's a real change now where,
yeah.
young people are saying, "Nope, I'm not gonna do that." So that consent has become a much bigger, um, part of their vocabulary.
And one of the thorniest areas in which you deal with that is with residential care and dementia.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
And
there are a lot of organizations in dementia care that don't have policy around that. And some of your work is spent advocating space for policy development. How's that going?
we are behind you all. In the US, we have very few tools through which we can measure sexual consent for people with cognitive impairments. We have very few policies that protect sexual wellness and sexual health for older adults with the desire to have a sexual life with cognitive impairments. And even if we take the dementia um, out of the equation, we have very few senior living communities that have any policies at all. So I'm interested in the organizational level and the macro level, and I'm on a kind of a exciting project right now. I'm working with a doctoral student who's developing an assessment tool. Now, I think, I'm not quite sure, but I think in some parts of New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, other parts of the world, there are some rather sophisticated assessment tools that staff members, clinicians mostly, can use to develop an understanding with the individual about whether there is the ability to arrive at sexual consent, either verbally or non-verbally, because I've been training people in getting a sense of what are the nonverbal cues, even if the person doesn't have the ability to form sentences any longer. And I'm excited about this project, and I think the student that I'm working with will be done by next year, and that we will be able to develop a new tool. But we really have very few policy level interventions. So, what does a policy entail? Training,
Right.
physical plan changes, privacy, risk, how much family members need to be involved. Does the family member really need to know about this or not, right? Those kinds of questions. Liability issues, legal issues. Who is the guardian here? There's so many levels where right now the senior living communities, which in the US sometimes have a couple of hundred people in the building, are making decisions like that, like in a nanosecond. They open the door, they walk in on two people having sex, and everybody goes, bananas.
Yeah.
Well, that's the wrong term, but everybody has a hard time, and nope, wrong term. Everybody is going just really running out of the apartment and doesn't know what to do. And so I think the the reason I'm looking forward to developing more policies is because it means we're going to have more conversations, and conversations are really, I mean, you call me an angelic troublemaker. That's very kind of you. John Lewis really was my hero. But I believe that we can do a lot by having conversations. These are the kinds of brave spaces that we need to develop, right? This is the moment where
Mm.
an executive team, a management team could sit around and say, I know that we've got a few people who are interested in each other, and I'm not quite sure if they all know what's going on. How do we handle that? What an amazing conversation to have
Yeah.
before someone from a family comes and complains about, you know, um, their mother doing something they didn't think she should be doing.
And also having conversations with our parents before or even if they go into res care about their sexuality and acknowledging it and creating space for that.
Right,
It's
right.
like a reverse flip goes on. For me, the analogy is very much around how we are with teenagers, where it seems like children of older parents assume an awful lot of ability to take control and to police the boundaries or to set the boundaries of somebody's life at a time where they might well be perfectly capable of making decisions.
Right. That's such an important point. I've been wondering about this. Do you think that the very same people who are blocking sex education for their children are going to be the same people who are blocking sexual liberation for their parents? I don't know. I have no idea. No one's done that research, but it seems like that adult child who is a barrier often can be turned around and could be really helpful if they wanted to have a conversation. Like, for instance, what if the older adults in that family were swingers or
Yeah.
into non-monogamy or polyamory, and the children never knew about it, or they were kinky and the kids never knew about it? What a disservice now that the child is going to try to, quote unquote, protect those parents from some untoward behavior. It just doesn't make any sense. We do need to have those conversations, and they're very hard for people to have.
Imagining our parents as sexual is tricky.
Totally.
Partly because I think literally we don't want to imagine anybody having sex unless it's Hollywood doing the job for us, because I would not want to record myself and watch later. This is not, it's beautiful in it, not apart from those whose preference it is to watch. It's not necessarily something I want to replay. But the idea of imagining our parents as enjoying pleasure, as having a life in which their need for connection was met. And it's the spaces around that maybe can allow some talk about solo sex. If it's an easier term, maybe that's one to put out there so people feel they have some language they can use around what was it like? What did you do? This is the generation that came through when they were swinging, when polyamory was expressing itself in a different way. It wouldn't be surprising.
Right.
And kink is another one. There's a beautiful kink community that's older. Somebody had to be in it. It's quite possibly one of our parents.
Right. One of the people I interviewed in my book, who's a wonderful guy, Hardy Haberman, who's been active in the leather community for years, said, one of the great things about leather when you get older is you still look good in leather.
It was him I was thinking about when I raised it. It was a beautifully written story.
So beautiful. Yeah, I love him. But let me ask you a question. When you say I wouldn't want that tape replayed, I often hear, particularly older women, say, "I don't want to undress in front of anyone anymore. I'm too self-conscious about my wrinkles or my sags," or they just feel like their body in some ways has betrayed them. And I guess the question I wanted to ask you is, how can we repair some of that damage, right? What are the images we need to see? Because we don't see beauty as old. We see old as scary, or old as yuck, or old as not beautiful.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to conflate those two things. I think that's a really important question. I don't think I'd want to watch a tape of myself at 17 when I was at my most lithe either. It's more, it's in the moment stuff. And we don't want to get that literal. But I totally hear you. And I think that so much of this is grounded in that cultural space where aging is a fearful thing, where youthfulness is the thing that we chase and validate. And I remember distinctly as a child nestling my head into the rounded belly of an elder and loving that body. And there was nothing about an aging body that was anything other than comforting and beautiful. And then as you get older, you are educated to understand that you should have lifted faces and no wrinkles, and your breasts should point up, not down, and you should have two of them. It's, this whole pursuit of youthfulness and sexuality as associated with it definitely sits in the middle of all of this for me. Your question, how do we do stuff about that? We have to, I guess, learn that we've been brainwashed.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And that's hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm asking because I'm always searching for new ways. I often say to older adults when I'm teaching a class, like in a senior center, for instance, with people from the community who live in maybe their own homes, they live in different places, maybe live in apartments. But I talk about ageism and I say, if it's scary to think about undressing in front of someone or having someone seeing your nakedness, right? I mean, nakedness, right? It's such a vulnerable place at any age. You're absolutely right. What I often say to people is check your lighting. If you have
Good
fluorescent
cue.
lights, right? If I have fluorescent lights like I have in my office here, get rid of those. Light a candle. Candles are really softer light. Get a dimmer, right? Just find some way to just bring the intensity down. Secondly, don't get undressed in front of them. Like, you don't have to. You're going to have to plan having sex when you're older anyway. So if you've planned this event, take your clothes off, put on something sexy that you look good in, and slide under the sheets. And when they join you, whoever the they is, might be one, might be two, I'm not limited here. Find a way where when you're looking at each other and you're about a quarter of an inch away from each other's eyes, you remember that you're looking into their soul just like they're looking into your soul. And those wrinkles and sags, they disappear at that moment because what you're seeing is really that beauty inside of them. And I try to convey that to people, and I often have done another thing which has been helpful. I show this slideshow of older bodies, of older naked bodies, and it's beautiful. And I give people a chance to just take a look at the ways in which older bodies can be seen. And the photos that I show them are just pieces of maybe an arm or a leg, right? Just a piece of it, just to take a sense of what that moment, that piece of that person is, and try not to get too judgmental about it. And then the third thing I think that I've done that maybe sometimes is helpful is I really ask people to think about what it was like when they were 15, 16, 17,
Mm.
18, and there was a lot of peer pressure, and their thighs were too big, they were too tall, their breasts weren't big enough, their penis wasn't long enough, whatever it is. And then remember that their body has really taken them through so many different experiences, maybe childbirth, right? Maybe a war,
Mm.
maybe incredible athletic feats, maybe sitting at home and writing, whatever it is, their body has helped them do it. And can they, in some small measure, be grateful to their body for taking them through this far?
Now, those are beautiful tools for
Mm.
navigating, I think, really wise.
Mm.
I certainly, I love that. I think, and the practicality of lighting,
Yeah, yeah.
we
Well,
ignore that,
yeah, yeah.
but
Well,
it's
also
so true.
we really got to plan though. When you're older, you got to plan. You got to make sure you have your lube, and you got to make sure you've got your meds, and you've got to make sure that you've got your speaker and your playlist, and you've got to make sure you've got tissues, and you got to make sure you've got all your sex toys charged. You know what I mean? You got to be planful when you get older. So
Yeah.
why
Although
not make the
having it,
lighting too? Yeah.
yeah, having your sex toy always charged allows you to be a bit spontaneous.
True,
Having
true, true,
having
true.
lube and tissues by the bed, lube is really important. I find myself so often talking about lube because it's one of those taboo subjects, and yet
I know, I know.
transformative.
Totally, 100%. And there's some lubes now that are developed for older bodies. In particular, there's one that has vitamin E and has really, I think, transformed the way a lot of older adults have been able to enjoy their sexual pleasure. And I often tell people it's not just PIV, penis and vagina, intercourse. We have so many other types of sexual expressions, including that term that I've been using, outer course, any kind of expression that doesn't include penetration. But just to get back to ageism for one more moment, I think ageism is so insidious, right? It's like it stops people in their tracks. And I think I'm developing a course for some social workers this summer. I'm going to teach it with a friend of mine who's a sex therapist. And we like doing that interplay between a sex educator and a sex therapist. And I really recommend talking with clinicians because they see everything on the micro level, but we get to see things sometimes more broadly on the macro level. And the course is talking about ageism, disabilities, and sexuality. And we're going to be talking about some of the theory behind it in terms of disability rights, CRIP theory. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Really, I think very exciting work going on. And then queer theory about this idea that older adult sex is kind of like queer sex because there's no procreation, there's no worry about contraception. We're really outside of that heteronormative usual sphere of sexual relationships. So developing that with ageism as the core, and then looking at disability and sexuality theory, I think is going to be extremely helpful for these social workers who are navigating a lot of new territory with their older patients.
Yeah, and I really like your conversation and other work around learning new sexual scripts.
Yeah, I mean, for many people, being on top doesn't work anymore, or going down on someone on your knees doesn't work anymore. So you've got to really think, okay, my knees aren't working, but my mouth is still working. So how can I change that one up? Or I never really was interested in anal, but gee, it just feels so much better than vaginal penetration. So how can I explore that? And again, the sexual script is yours, right? It's not about yours with your partner. It's yours first. And then you can bring that to your partner or your partners to describe what it is that, because of your physical challenges, you'd like to use a wedge or a pillow, or change up not just the ways in which you're having sex, but also the timing, the kind of necessary accoutrements that you're going to want by your side. And when you talked about toys being charged up or lube, a lot of the sexual scripts that people were used to may no longer be available to them after a hip operation, or maybe because of a neuropathy due to diabetes, or a cancer diagnosis. So it's really important to begin those conversations with an understanding of one's own body and one's own desires, and also that idea of spontaneous desire versus responsive desire, right? I no longer walk into a room in my 90s just lusting after someone. They've got to sort of kind of move me there, or I've got to move me there. I'm not just going to be there automatically. So that's a script change as well. And I do find that people really relate to that. They really get excited when I talk about that because it gives them hope, right?
Yeah.
It's another sense of, okay, my time is not all the way over. I can still have this incredible pleasure, because of course it's going to change everything if you can still have a sexual life, because we know all the health benefits of a sexual experience and frequent and regular sexual expression.
I think we do, but maybe it's good to remind people listening that there are actual health benefits to.
Oh yes, there are. Oh yeah. So ready?
Yeah.
One of my favorite sex researchers, Dr. Beverly Whipple, who is fantastic and still with us and going strong. She wrote a book in the 80s about the G spot. You may have heard of her. She's fantastic. she's done a lot of research on women's sexual response, and she's done work on spinal cord injuries and how you can still have an orgasm even after a spinal cord injury. I mean, she's really done some amazing research. But about 10 years ago, she and a group of her fellow sexuality researchers decided they wanted to look at what are the health benefits of regular sexual expression. So among a myriad of articles that they pulled together, and I really recommend your listeners taking a look at Beverly Whipple, Whipple, and her colleagues' work. One was um, reduction in the risk of heart disease and the complications of heart disease, reductions in the risk of cancer, including two of the most conspicuous forms of cancer, prostate and breast cancer, relief of chronic pain, in particular because an orgasm and an orgasmic response brings with it a release of not only some important neurotransmitters like oxytocin, but also some other hormonal and other chemical effects like endorphins that can literally change your body's ability to withstand pain and suppress pain receptors. So incredible, right? I mean, thinking about
Amazing.
orgasm as a pain reliever, and then a number of other areas, including general mental health response as being elevated, and physical health response. And when some of the sex researchers looked at older adults' health benefits, what they found was that it actually can improve your physical and mental health at a later age. And so Beverly Whipple and her colleagues were looking at across the lifespan, and really they were mostly looking at people in their 20s and 30s and 40s, and mostly heterosexual. So there's very little research on anyone outside of the heteronormative sexual relationship. But in my own research, what I found was that I didn't look at uh, frequency or regular sexual expression. What I did look at was sexual satisfaction. And what I found was that those older adults in same-sex relationships, so again, this area that was, titrating down to a population that is rarely studied, people in their 60s to mid-70s in same-sex relationships had very high resilience, very low internalized homophobia, right? That idea that what the world, the sort of fear and hatred that the world was putting out about who you were not internalizing it. Very high relationship satisfaction, and that those three were correlated. So that if you think about it, now this is not causality, this is just correlation, that these folks with these folks in older adults, part of the population in same-sex relationships, indicated a very high ability to deal with life's troubles. That's what resiliency is, right? And they've been through a lot of life's troubles because they've been through many years of maybe not being able to come out, or invisibility, or oppression, or certainly violence has occurred. The resilience and the internalized homophobia were connected to relationship satisfaction. And what was most interesting was that given those three as sort of a triangle, relationship satisfaction was a predictor of sexual satisfaction for this population. And what I want to say is their sexual satisfaction wasn't that high. It was kind of moderate. So there's work to be done there, right? There's more education to be done. There's more policy level, political work, activist work that needs to be done for this population. But I can really begin to see that the health effects could be really pushed into a positive direction for that population as well.
It's amazing and important work. And I'm glad that we got back to it. I think it's, I'm looking forward to seeing more of it.
Yeah, thank you. I want to do more. Actually, I'm excited about this, and I'm always trying to find other graduate students who need a doctoral dissertation. So if any listeners out there are looking
Yeah.
for a dissertation, call me, write to me, and I'll help you figure out some good ideas, good questions.
Definitely put that shout out. And also that reminds me of your book, which I did want to strongly advocate for people reading, not only because it dials up resilience, the Stonewall generation over time, but it really importantly for me unpacks through tracing some of the roots of where we come from, where we are, why we should never take that work for granted, and what it took to become resilient for the people that you talk to, the stories in your book. It feels like a very important book to read.
Thank you so much. That's so kind of you. I'm really glad you got to read it.
Oh, me too. It's amazing.
Storytelling is such an important tool, isn't it?
It is. And I guess there's a shout out as well for those who are looking for things to write about.
Yeah.
Sexuality and older people is there's a dearth of representation, as you say. And it would be good to, I'm sure there are plenty of older authors out there.
Yeah, and plenty of older people whose stories have never been heard. And
Yes.
what I loved about the book was that these are people who aren't famous. They're not, they're not celebrities. These are regular people who've been working for their whole lives to make changes toward what I believe is sexual liberation, to take us way back 52 years ago to the roots of the modern, what I call gay rights movement from the 70s in the US was begun at the Stonewall Tavern that night on June 28th, 1969. I mean, that was a sexual liberation moment.
Yeah.
And we need to really come back to that. And the people I interviewed in my book really gave me so much courage to continue to be brave and to be strong and to be outspoken and to be a troublemaker, to continue to be a troublemaker. I'm so happy that I got to meet these individuals, and they all represent different movements and different parts of the struggle to become truly a social justice warrior.
Yeah, and I think it's a reminder not to take for granted that we progress inevitably towards better.
Yeah. But Jane, I have to say, the Pride festivals this year are starting to happen again. We lost a year.
Yeah.
We couldn't have Pride. But they're all being taken over by young people. It's so exciting.
Oh, that's
people
cool.
like me who started a Pride march in my little town in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1982, where we had 30 people standing because we didn't really have any permits or anything.
Oh.
We're too old now, right? We're getting to be the people who need to be the advisors. But the young people are now starting to say, at least in New York, Boston, some of the largest cities in the U.S., these are people who've been out on the streets. Millions of people have been out on the streets for the last 2 years, demonstrating with Black Lives Matter movements all over the country against police brutality, which was one of the key issues that the Stonewall Rebellion was really about. And I'm not saying we need to step aside because we don't have anything to say. What I mean is we need to allow for young people to take leadership, just like we did when we were young, to move forward, to allow them to bring some of the new knowledge that they've been gaining being on the streets and fighting against police for the last couple of years in the US. We need to allow them to take pride in a really exciting, what I think is a liberation direction, where pride has kind of meandered a bit and become a bit more assimilationist, at least here in the US.
I think that's wonderful at one level. At another, I want to challenge the stepping back of elders and say maybe walking side by side rather than disappearing.
Okay, that's very kind. But I've had many years of being in front of the microphone. I've been an activist for a long time. Before I became an academic and before I became a sex researcher, I was on the front lines a lot, and it was great fun. I loved it. It was terrific. But the truth is, other people have an opportunity now to to get in the front of the microphone and to really be able to be heard. And I want to be able to walk shoulder to shoulder for sure, but I also want to make room. I guess maybe that's it. Maybe you're right. So instead of saying the word stepping back, maybe making room for
Beautiful.
allowing other people's voices to be heard. Because there's a guy at the end of my book. Did you see that guy, Joey Wasserman, who's in his 30s, whose life is to work with LGBTQ elders. He loves doing that work. And he believes that storytelling is the way to do it. And he wants to bring his generation forward by hearing the stories of his elders.
I think that there's a book there that maybe he could have a go at.
Yeah.
You know, that just asking that question, what's your sexuality story, of people in their 80s and 90s? And that would be a really interesting book.
Yeah. Well, I started with that question. I started with, where were you the night of Stonewall, June 28th? But I couldn't start with, what has your sexual life been like? Because people get too nervous. But about an hour into the conversation, I then steered it toward, so tell me about, what was your sexual life back then? And what's your sexual life now? And I heard amazing stories from people. You know, there's two women in the book who said they met in their 60s. And they had the best sex in their 60s that they'd ever had in their entire lives. That blew my mind. And I just loved that they were able to say that, and that they were able to experience it. And one of them just turned 90 this year, and they're still together.
Which is really cool.
Yeah, very cool.
And actually, I want to make that point, Jane, because you said you have a lot of work to do because you're already older. But given one of your heroines was still working at 100, you've a whole lifetime of work ahead of you.
I know. And in my field, people do seem to have great longevity. You know, Pat Schiller lived to 103. She was the president of our national organization. And my mentor lived to be actually 102. So you're right. I've got some years left, but I can't dawdle. That's the key.
Perfect.
I can't sit around too much. I got to keep moving.
Well, I think what we need to do is kind of keep in touch and have you back to tell us more.
Great. Thank you so much.
It's been an amazing conversation. There's so much to cover. It's really hard to create space for it all. But you've given us a wonderful window into your world and what you do. And it's a great mission, Jane.
Thank you.
You know, anything we can do to help from this end. And I think to anybody listening, the takeout here is to remember that older people are sexual, enjoy sex, have sex. And there are those that choose not to and prefer not to, which is fine too. But it's in your own interest to challenge the prevailing thinking around this, because you're moving to that space and it will be you one day.
Right.
And so, you know, do you want someone to tell you can't be sexual? Is there going to be, as Jane said in one of her talks, an expiration date to your sexuality? Don't go there.
Don't go there.
You're
so right. You're so right. And you know, when you're thinking about all the oppressions in the world, and we got to deal with class and classism and racism, right? We've got to deal with sexism. Remember that ageism is that one oppression that, if we're lucky enough to age, we're all going to have to deal with. And so you're absolutely right. Working on that now. And also, the people who have had the best sexual lives in their 50s will probably have the best sexual lives in their 80s as well, because they'll continue it and they'll learn how to change with their bodies. So, yeah, I think your message is a really good takeaway. And I think I have one more takeaway, which is, don't be afraid to challenge those stereotypes when you're younger, because it becomes more habitual. So I challenged stereotypes when I was young, and I'm still challenging them now because I know how to do that, right? I've changed the stereotype that I'm bumping up against, but I'm used to opening my mouth, and I'm used to raising a bit of a ruckus, and I think it's served me well. And it has also helped my children see that they can have permission as well to do that. So, yeah. So any of the listeners who want to think about aging in a new way, this is an opportunity to think about sex in a new way when you're younger, so that you can carry that forward as you age.
Great message.
Thanks.
Awesome,
Thanks so
Jane.
much for having me. Thank you.
You for
It's such
being
a pleasure to be with you. What a treat.